Hi there, 7th graders. This is History, Chapter 14. I will be reading Section 4, Spanning a Continent, starting on page 462. Do follow along. Our main idea for this section: Americans continued moving westward across the continent through the early and mid-1800s. In this video, we're going to learn why the Mormons settled in what is now Utah, and how California's population boomed in 1849. I'm guessing you probably have a little bit of prior knowledge about what is in this section. In July 1847, Brigham Young stood on a hill overlooking Utah's Salt Lake Valley. According to legend, Young saw a vision of a great city. He turned to the people who had followed him into the desert. "This is the right place," Young declared confidently. The Mormons. Young's view of Salt Lake Valley marked the end of a 1,300-mile journey from Iowa. Young and his followers had walked the entire distance, hauling their possessions behind them in two-wheeled carts. They came to the desert for the same reason countless settlers had first traveled to North America: for religious freedom. Would you be willing to walk that far? That's a long journey on foot. They had a strong desire, obviously. A new church. The settlers of Utah belonged to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They referred to themselves as saints. Most people, though, knew them as Mormons. The Mormons owed their origins to Joseph Smith, a farmer in upstate New York. In the 1820s, Smith had a vision that convinced him to found a new Christian sect or religious group. Smith's faith and enthusiasm won converts. Several of his beliefs, however, won even more enemies. Smith believed that property should be held in common. He also supported polygamy, the idea that a man could have more than one wife. This angered a large number of people in the 1800s. Mormons eventually gave up this practice. Journey into the desert. Harassed by neighbors suspicious of their beliefs, the Mormons moved from New York to Ohio to Missouri and then to Illinois. In 1844, a mob attacked and killed Smith. His successor, Brigham Young, decided to lead the Mormons to shelter in the far west. In 1847, about 150 Mormons began their long trek. Eventually, more than 15,000 people made the difficult journey, following Young to Utah Territory. Over the next decade, the Mormons built 1,043 miles of canals and irrigated 154,000 acres of formerly arid or dry land. In 1850, Congress recognized Young as the governor of the Utah Territory. By 1860, about 30,000 Mormons lived in Salt Lake City and more than 90 other towns in present-day Utah. And Utah eventually entered the Union in 1896 as the 45th state. 45th state. We move a little further west, California, rushing to California. As the Mormons built houses in the desert, Swiss immigrant John Sutter ordered a crew of workers to build a sawmill along the American River in Northern California. On January 24, 1848, a golden glint in the river caught the eye of John Marshall, the supervisor of the job. Marshall reached into the water and pulled out a lump of ore. A single word slipped through Marshall's lips: gold. Marshall tried to keep his discovery a secret, but word spread quickly to nearby towns. The mayor of Monterey, California, described the reaction of the townspeople. "The farmers have thrown aside their plows, the lawyers their briefs, the doctors their pills, the priests their prayer books, and all are now digging for gold." 49ers by the shipload. The gold seekers who stampeded into California became known as 49ers for the year 1849, in which many of them came. Thousands of 49ers sailed to San Francisco from New York, Boston, and Galveston. Most traveled all the way around the southern tip of South America. Some more adventurous or impatient travelers sailed to the Isthmus of Panama. They climbed on mules, and rode through the steamy, hot jungle to reach the Pacific coast. And then at the coast, they caught ships bound for California. The people who departed from the ships in San Francisco came from nearly every corner of the earth. During the first half of 1849, 5,000 miners arrived from Chile alone, that's a country in South America, and others came from as far away as China. Traveling overland. By far, the greatest number of gold seekers traveled to California on overland trails. Guided by former mountain men, many traveled over a southern spur of the Oregon Trail, called the California Trail. Still others headed over the Mormon Trail. In 1849 alone, more than 80,000 people poured across the continent. And a few of those trails, they went right here through Nebraska. There are several trails that go right along the Platte River all the way through Nebraska, which is really cool that we have a piece of that history right here. Life in the mining towns. When the 49ers reached California, they threw up temporary towns overnight with names such as Shinbone Peak and You Bet. Most townspeople lived in tents. The lucky ones owned cabins, most of which lacked windows or chimneys. Some women staked claims, but more made money by opening boarding houses or laundries. One laundress along the Feather River earned $1,000 a week, more than some miners. Mining towns had no police or prisons, so robbers posed a real threat to business owners and miners, also called prospectors. So townspeople took law into their own hands, forming vigilance committees. The committee members, or vigilantes, drove petty thieves out of town and hanged murderers. Such hasty justice became known as vigilante justice, a law without judge or jury. They just took matters into their own hands. Dreams of freedom. In 1849, California delegates drafted a constitution that prohibited slavery. The next year, California entered the Union as a free state. Hoping to find riches and freedom, a number of African Americans headed west. By 1852, more than 2,000 African Americans lived in California. Some struck it rich in the mines. Others succeeded at business enterprises. Biddy Mason, for example, worked as a nurse. She then invested her savings in real estate until she built up a fortune. As a group, African Americans in California boasted savings of more than $2.3 million in 1855. The shadow of prejudice, however, still produced huge inequalities. The California legislature denied African Americans the right to vote. Black laws barred African Americans from testifying in court and prohibited integrated schools. Led by African American journalists such as San Francisco newspaper owner Mifflin Gibbs, African Americans forced the repeal of black laws, but they did not win the vote until passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870. Freedom lost. For Native Americans, the migration of thousands of settlers to California proved disastrous. Prospectors forced Native Americans to work. Native American men toiled in the mines, while Native American women worked in households. Disease and forced labor reduced the Native American population in California from about 150,000 in 1848 to 35,000 by 1860. The national government had created the Bureau of Indian Affairs in 1824. The Bureau attempted to reduce Native American land claims. In the 1850s, the government advocated confining Native Americans on reservations, or land set aside for Native Americans. Despite Native Americans' fierce resistance to this policy, by 1858, the Bureau had created 8 reservations in California. The search for the Gold Mountain. Immigrants from China also felt the heavy hand of prejudice. Lured by tales of the Americans' Gansam, or Gold Mountain, hundreds of Chinese peasants poured into California from 1849 to 1851. By 1852, their numbers had swelled into the thousands. The rising tide of immigration from Asia alarmed the miners in the United States. In 1852, they convinced state lawmakers to tax foreign-born miners who did not plan to become citizens. Federal law limited citizenship to whites, so Chinese miners had to pay the tax or quit mining. Under the law, the government took in a total of $5 million from the pockets of Chinese prospectors. Forced out of mining, the Chinese opened other businesses. Chinese laundries, restaurants, and boarding houses became familiar sights in the mining towns. In San Francisco, these shops made up a city within a city, called Chinatown. The end of the gold rush. Although the gold rush continued into the 1850s, latecomers found little gold left in rivers and streams. And after a few years, large companies took over most of the mining in California. Many 49ers settled down as farmers, shopkeepers, or city workers in towns like San Francisco. When the mines ran dry, smaller towns went bust, and people moved on, and many towns became abandoned ghost towns. Thanks for listening.